Our reading is taken from Acts chapter 17. Paul then stood up at the meeting of the Areopagus. He said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far away from any of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection from the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." And at that, Paul left the council. This week saw the celebration of the slightly unfortunately named Saint Corona. Traditions in the church remember Saint Corona as the martyr alongside St. Victor. St. Victor was a Roman soldier tortured for his Christian faith by having his eyes gouged out. How's your Brackley so far? Saint Corona, a teenage woman, displayed her Christian compassion by caring for him. And for this, she was tied between two palm trees that had been roped together. And when the bonds of the two trees were cut, they sprang back into their natural place, tearing Saint Corona apart. This happened in the year 165. Well, isn't that a lovely and grisly way to start today? A horrible history of the Christian heritage. But I share this because for me there is something here about feeling the tension of the current time, pulling the compassion and the fear, hope. I identify with this psychological breakdown of society as we're facing this next phase of the pandemic response. As an aside, I also love that Saint Corona is the patron saint of treasure hunters. Even by being torn apart, I wonder whether we're able to join in God's playfulness as we find out the treasure hunt of grace. I wonder whether you feel as if you are being torn in at least two directions. I wonder whether you're able to receive this grace of the treasure hunters, or if life is still all that little bit too confusing and messy right now. I've sat down and wrote some of the things that I've been feeling even over this last week, and it's quite a list. I still recognise that excitement of at some point going to have lots of free time, but also the frustration that with two children who know now how to unlock the bathroom door, I never have a moment to myself. The anger at plans being cancelled, including a much needed family holiday next week. sadness and anger at still not being able to see grandma and granddad, guilt at not doing enough, creativity flourishing where we see what might be possible, guilt that this is forcing comparisons from friends and colleagues, an overwhelming anxiety about the future, fear about leaving the house, especially if I have to join a queue, lists, lots and lots and lots of lists, concern for those far worse off, confusion about what might be for the best, especially when it comes to educating my children, tiredness, exhaustion, Zoom overwhelm. I had a 14-hour call this week. That did me in. Guilt at not being a good parent, sadness that my children's experience of school is not going to be the same as I would expect, and hope that things are going to be different. It's exhausting. And I hear it in other people as well, the friends that I have and the pastoral calls that I make. Tired, scared, hopeful, anxious, angry, fearful, concerned, guilty, overwhelmed, lonely, doubting, lost, frustrated, loving. 1,000 emotions bubbling under the surface, hidden in the depths of our muscles, twisted in our guts and racking our brains. In some ways, we have never been here before. And in other ways, humanity has been here time and time and time again. So there's a few things that I wanted to say about how we might be feeling and what we might need in order to be resilient for the coming days. How can we be a fearless and faithful people? I want us to recognise what we have lost and that we will not have back again. Some churches will not reopen. Some people have lost family and friends and loved ones. The churches are too vulnerable. Their finances are too precarious. Their leadership courageous enough to make the difficult decisions for life-giving discipleship. We too have lost our freedom. We've lost contact with our friends and families. We've lost a way of life that we took for granted. And for some of us, we may have lost the certainty of our faith. After all, if God is all-powerful, what's with this virus? So the first clue to being resilient is to recognise how we are feeling. It's the AA that say the first place, the Alcoholics Anonymous, not the car people. It's Alcoholics Anonymous that say the first way of finding healing and hope is by admitting you have a problem. So the first thing we need to do is recognise how we are feeling, because how we are feeling is part of a grief cycle, and grief takes time and it takes energy. And if we don't give grief the time and the energy it needs, it has a nasty way of metastasizing into something else. And grief is a rather sociable being. It tends to want to invite other unwanted guests of previous experiences to the party as well. So in grief, we have some tools to acknowledge that things will never be the same again. I'll say that again. Things are never going to be quite the same again. And it's okay to be sad about this. And it's okay to be excited about this. It's okay to feel this, and it's okay to think about what that might mean. Because however you're feeling is important. Your experience matters, because only you are having this experience. The grief writer and chief guru, David Kessler, says that there are 6 processes in grief. A movement between the relationship of isolation, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and meaning. I wonder how many of those you're already able to identify within yourself over these last 11 weeks. And I wonder how many you've noticed in past experiences of grief and loss and bereavement in your own lives. And I wonder how this experience is mirroring for you or bringing up for you other experiences of loss and of grief, unawares and unwantedly. We can try and put the lid on, but we know that it will come back to bite us in the end. We need to remind ourselves that we need to lose things in order to grow, and that a global trauma of a pandemic is forcing us to lose things we never thought about losing. In good times, it's easy to make meaning, to find purpose, to be creative, and to be in the groove of love and discipleship. In grief, it is almost impossible. We should not be moving to make meaning right now, but we should start talking, recognizing what's happening to ourselves and to our bodies in the midst of a lockdown. There is something deeply incarnational about bodies and dust and soil, about the opportunity we have to dive deeper into grief so that we are better equipped for God's future. But what does all this have to say in Acts? What tools does Paul provide for us in this passionate passage? A passage normally associated with how to be a good missionary and how to talk about Jesus wherever you are. I want to suggest that there are 10 things that we need to take from this, which helps us in our early stages of global grief. The first is that God is present. Even where God seems absent to an unknown gods in the marketplace festooned on their statues, God was already at work, waiting to be discovered. Secondly, God might be different to what we expect. The unmasking of gods in this passage is not on Paul's terms, and it's not on the Greeks' terms. Together they debate and discuss and come to a place where they understand each other and they notice God as something renewed and different. There is a sense that in the midst of the unknown, God is revealed as something accessible and different to whoever journeys, but nobody has the full picture. Thirdly, understanding ourselves and discovering God in these times relies on poets and philosophers, not just on scientists and politicians. The Greeks are in full creative, innovative mode. They want to share ideas because the ideas are interesting. They hold court in the public spaces, pontificating about possibilities just because they've got an audience. They shape their meaning through those great epic poems of the past, and they're shaped by philosophical debate and shared experiences. Their way of life is rich and extravagant and abundant. And some of it is full of bravado, of veneer, of loose promises. But the poetry and the philosophers helped to think and to shape what was to come. Fourthly, we need to treasure the questions that we have. It's not for us to make meaning now. It may be not for us to have answers. But fifthly, we are to listen to the questions that are being asked outside of us as well. Notice how many people in wider society are asking about how to pray right now. It's actually one of the top 5 Google searches in the UK. How do I pray? 6, Jesus will always divide opinion. 7, Loss hurts. Those who are listening to Paul and whose own understanding and belief systems were challenged and changed got angry. And our faith development means that when we lose some things as well as gain them, our loss and our anger matters. Because 8, our relationships matter. 9, it's not our time to make meaning. And the Greeks didn't really know how to make meaning out of it either. But 10, God's is present and God is here. When we are struggling to find meaning, when hope is hard to come by, when the lockdown limits seem to be lessened and yet our fear remains, when faces begin to be covered with masks so you can't quite see the glint in someone else's eyes, when meaning is like dust beneath our feet because we've walked the same patch of our garden for the last 8 weeks and the garden centres have run out of grass seed, Paul reminds us to keep on looking. The answers are present before us, or at least find the questions. Paul reminds us that God is present even when we're feeling God's absence. Paul reminds us to stay creative even if it's the last thing we want to do. Paul reminds us to keep the main thing, especially when on a good day some of our greatest achievements can be getting out of our pyjamas. We've heard the poem, The Peace of the Wild Things. When everything is in vapour and tears, the wild spirit still blows. Peace descends and we wait. If we trust the stillness and the silence, when we centre ourselves and be present to the moment, we begin to breathe again. We notice where we hold tension in our bodies, and we can take one further step into the unknown before us. To the unknown God, says the statue in the marketplace. Step towards the unknown, says Paul, because the paradox of the kingdom of God is that it's in the unknowing, the undoing, the uncertain, the unexpected that God might be found. One of the geniuses of the ancient labyrinth patterns is that the closer you think you are to the centre, the furthest you are away. And vice versa, the furthest you feel as though you are from the centre, you are actually far, far nearer to God's presence at the middle. So today, whether you're feeling distant from people, from creation, from God, in the midst of our individual and corporate unknowing, may we hear that promise. In the unknown, you are closer than you think. Take one more step. Dig in deeper. We can do it together because we are doing this together. And it's okay for us to fall apart, because by falling apart, we may fall into grace. So maybe there is a little bit more treasure to be found in Saint Corona. May we find treasures in these moments, even before we're able to find meaning. May we be people who dig deeply, because that takes us to the difficult parts of our souls. May we spend the longer time acknowledging our grief and facing into the things that we've lost. May we find treasures in our tension of fear and hope, and may we fall into something greater.